Hey everybody, Nevin Gusak back with another episode of the Populist Patriot. Um, this episode, we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be reading some passages and quotes with some discussion points about a book that recently came out. I'm just going to gather my pages here and just gather this. Thank you all for your patience. And it's called, well, it's a little backwards here. It's called American Kleptocracy: How the U.S. Created the World's Greatest Money Laundering Scheme in History by Casey Michel, Michel. And there's very interesting information in here. It shows that how various allied as well as hostile foreign governments, including ones in the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, as well as others, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, etc., were using the deregulated American financial markets and banking systems to basically deposit their ill-gotten wealth throughout the world, including in American banks, and investing it in American private financial institutions. So that's where it kind of got discussed over here, and it's really, really very, very, very interesting. Interesting book over here. So I kind of wanted to read some interesting excerpts, for example. And it talks about, in brief, Muammar Gaddafi, the former anti-American socialist Islamist dictator in Libya. Well, it says here the deceased Libyan leader reportedly squirreled his and his country's fortune away inside a series of anonymous shell companies abroad. And, American, during and after the 1980s, American financial institutions were deregulated, all in the name of being pro-business and everything else and the wonders of the marketplace. And no doubt that some of Gaddafi's monies were invested in American banking and other financial institutions. Slobodan Milosevic, the genocidal Serbian autocrat, who was also socialist and anti-American, aligned with Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, Libya, etc., etc. He used anonymous shell companies to skirt sanctions and to continue his carnage against prone populations in Bosnia and Kosovo. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un, all of them, including their family members and inner circles, have funneled untold billions through anonymous shell companies far away from the eyes of their people and Western investigators alike. And more often than not, these dictators and their cronies and their oligarchs have turned to the U.S. to do it. And we'll later learn, because of the wonderful thing of deregulation, so beloved by conservatives and Clinton neoliberal market fundamentalists. So let's continue here. Just get through this. And Michel writes, given the capitalistic deregulatory ethos of the country, meaning the United States, it makes sense that the most efficient means of setting up these anonymous shells would come in the U.S. Plus, there's an entire industry already built up to service legitimate, perfectly above-board companies in the U.S., an industry whose tools just so happen to work perfectly for corrupt officials or narco traffickers or foreign oligarchs trying to set up anonymous shells as well. But this book also talked about here, nearly half of the company service providers didn't bother to require identifying documents certified by any government body. This is during Senate investigations. And more than a fifth didn't even require any photo identities documents at all, meaning in creating these, quote, anonymous shell companies in the United States. As one of the researchers pithily wrote, disturbingly, the results presented here suggest that those selling shell companies are almost completely insensitive to the danger of corruption. And one country stood out more than all others, the US, where setting up an anonymous shell company was obscenely easy. This is actually, a few years ago, was a trio of academics who were actually uncovering that. But there were also senatorial investigations about this too as well. But the ease with which American company service providers set up these shells still shocked the researchers, as they found all it required was as little as $100 and as few as 15 minutes on the phone with a company service provider to walk you through the paperwork. All you need is a name for the company and check made out to the company service provider, or better yet, direct payment from a foreign bank account, preferably one that U.S. authorities couldn't trace even if they wanted to. And it goes on, but that's a little taste of what's going on. Here's another quote. What came through pretty clearly, Brigham Young University's Daniel Nielsen, one of the researchers behind this research project that I was describing, said that what came through pretty clearly is that amongst all the venues in the world, the easiest place to get an anonymous shell company is the United States. And interesting, on the flip side, these researchers found that the countries and jurisdictions that required the most information for those trying to set up an anonymous shell company included either traditional, quote, offshore havens, such as the Cayman Islands or the Isle of Man, or outright dictatorships like Belarus, which was under the sort of Soviet-type social neo-communist, basically, dictator Alexander Lukashenko, or Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Michelle, the author of this book, writes, the U.S. has seen decades of deregulation across its economy, often pushed in the name of easing burdens on businesses. This quote-unquote pro-business ethos, ascendant since the 1980s, conquered much of the American body politic on both sides of the political aisle. And as we'll see time and again throughout this book, that ethos infected all the industries that have transformed into the linchpins of American kleptocracy. In many ways, those attempts to ease business operations and to attract as much capital to the U.S. as possible are the core reasons that the U.S. transformed into the world's greatest offshore haven. Okay, guys, America's not becoming a socialist country. It's not becoming a fascist country. It's not becoming a communist country. The United States is a plaything for global as well as domestic plutocrats that, generally speaking, have no loyalty to the United States or its people. And he continues, the author here continues, after all, deregulation didn't just open the U.S. to a new world of clean, legitimate capital flows. It also opened America's arms to as much dirty money as the world could provide. So the so-called conservative economic policies of deregulation, once again, is harming American national security and encouraging the economic and therefore political penetration of our geopolitical enemies, all in the name of being pro-business and limited government and total free markets and everything. Again, this book is showing through careful research that free markets is not synonymous with a strong national security position. And this book, American Kleptocracy, uh, traces the development of the liberalization, the deregulation of laws governing the activities of foreign capital and the development of anonymous shell corporations, which talked about how Delaware developed into this free-for-all state for international as well as domestic financial services, both ones that are totally above board and legitimate and good for the nation, as well as financial activities by domestic as well as international uh, financial institutions that are frankly more seedier and more of concern for national security considerations. In fact, New Jersey, back during the Gilded Age, because of the deregulation that occurred in the United States during the Gilded Age, in fact, New Jersey became known as the traitor state because it left all other states, and New Jersey sucked up the taxes and fee the other states suddenly lost out on. So a lot of states lost out on revenue because all these financial institutions were incorporating in New Jersey and Delaware. This was during the Gilded Age, late 1800s, early 1900s. So it really just became a sort of free-for-all, and it hasn't gotten better since then. And there's just a lot of history on Delaware. So I really recommend that you get the book, either borrow it from your local library or purchase it on Amazon.com or your local brick and mortar bookstore or through bookfinder.com. Find this book and either purchase it or borrow it from your local library. And here's how the conservatives killed efforts, the so-called conservatives, because they're really not conservatives, they're radical free market globalists and libertarian types, which is not conservative in my estimation. Senator Carl Levin in 1999 joined Republican Senator Arlen Specter to draft a bill with a range of proposed legislative fixes, including banning shell bank operations, pushing for greater oversight of correspondent accounts, and instituting basic due diligence requirements on billions of foreign dollars barreling into American banks. But the bill ended up in the Senate Banking Committee, whose chair was Texas GOP Senator Phil Gramm, some of whose key constituents were Texas-based banks that were popular destinations for the deluge of dirty money flowing north from places like Mexico and Central America. None of the members of the Texas Bankers Association, with Gramm as their effective mouthpiece, saw any reason to change business as usual. One of Carl Levin's staff members, senator from Michigan, said, "Gramm responded to our bill with a deafening silence." From there, Levin's anti-money laundering window only seemed to shrink. The election of George W. Bush revived an anti-regulatory ethos in Washington, decreasing the appetite for banking restrictions and oversight, even those advancing the anti-money laundering campaign his father's administration helped propel. According to Glennie, for Bush and his team, the only good anti-money laundering strategy was no anti-money laundering strategy. Regulations to opponents would only get in the way of American business. And for an economy still centered on the kind of deregulatory ethos ascendant since the 1980s, and for American industries watching billions flowing in, those regulations were non-starters. Still, Levin didn't give up. Jewish man, by the way. So not all Jews are unpatriotic, by the way, and pawns of the big finance of Wall Street and elsewhere in the United States. Just had to slip that in there. Still, Levin didn't give up. In the summer of 2001, the senator corralled a half dozen co-sponsors, including a number of Republicans, to launch a second, even stronger anti-money laundering bill. But just as before, Graham was a big proponent of Reaganomics deregulation, the exploitation of undocumented and documented immigrants near slave labor. He was for trading with China. He was for in 1989. By 1989, Senator Graham was for giving Gorbachev's Soviet Union most favored nations trade status. I think in 1989 or 1990. He also had ties with financial institutions associated with Saddam's Iraq and was therefore against sanctions on Ba'athist socialist Iraq in the late 1980s. That was covered in Human Events newspaper. I mean, Graham was a corrupt scumbag. He's an asshole. He's anti-American. He's basically a Dixiecrat economically, actually more of a Bourbon Democrat from like the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Graham is not a Republican. Graham is a Bourbon Democrat reincarnated as a Reagan Republican. Anyways, so sorry for the sidetracking here. Still, Levin didn't give up. In the summer of 2001, the senator corralled a half dozen co-sponsors, including a number of Republicans, to launch a second, even stronger anti-money laundering bill. But just as before, Graham, at the behest of the Texas Bankers Association, welcomed the bill into his Senate Banking Committee and strangled it in the crib. There you go. There you go. There you go. Over the past few years, a number of corporate filings in of all places, China, communist red China, revealed that a number of Chinese oligarchs have begun smuggling their money into South Dakota. Tens of billions of dollars in suspect Chinese monies have flowed to the state, including billions tied to Chinese real estate developers and billions more tied directly to one of China's wealthiest women. That is, the oligarchs and kleptocrats who've grown wealthy from their ties to the ruling dictatorship in Beijing, a communist dictatorship, have effectively partnered with officials in South Dakota to hide their money to partake in this prairie-based version of American kleptocracy. This is what Phil Gramm, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and the whole corral of globalist, financial, corrupt, so-called conservatives have enabled. So-called conservatives. Okay. We got more here. And in the U.S. private equity and hedge funds, the types that were defended by Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential campaign, yeah, those. And that is defended by the likes of Mosa National Review and Conservative Incorporated, yeah, those hedge funds and private equity. And many of whom are also defended and who fund corporate so-called third-way Democrats, by the way. So, and in the U.S., private equity and hedge funds can do so with no obligation to check the sources of client wealth or even figure out who they're offering their anonymous financial services to. These funds are, quote, are doing the same thing as the Swiss banks, anonymizing money on an industrial scale, wrote investigative journalist Tom Burgess. Already, we've seen substantial sums from Chinese, Russian, and Saudi sources circling among these private, unregulated investment firms. One Wall Street Journal investigation, for instance, found that, quote, the Saudi government has been the largest Silicon Valley startup funder since mid-2016, investing in at least $11 billion. But thanks to the Treasury Department's temporary exemption, Bloomberg wrote, the U.S. knows shockingly little about the sources of foreign finance flowing through hedge funds and private equity, or about just how much of those industries is propped up by dirty money. So I'm just reading these portions of these quotes here. So we're enabling some of the most barbaric, horrific human rights violators, as well as geopolitical enemies and untrustworthy governments, all in the name of deregulation. They exploit it. They exploit our loose standards when it comes to capital investments. So you got Saudi Arabia, Russia, China. Beautiful, beautiful. FBI and Senate investigators, journalists and activists, national security voices, and electoral security experts, we have all clamored for years about the need for the end of anonymity in these sectors, meaning the financial sectors, these favorite playgrounds of Russian oligarchs and corrupt Chinese kleptocrats and sanctioned Iranian officials. All those sectors that keep the engine of American kleptocracy running at full steam. And of course, that's just, as we've learned, all in the name of deregulation and free markets, we allow the door to be open to corrupt and hostile governments, China, Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin and the United Russia Party, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Gaddafi's Libya, North Korea. Who else? Michelle, the author here, mentions, and it's clear that without American leadership, the efforts to end the broader world of offshoring or of transnational money laundering or of rising oligarchies and oligopolies, both foreign and domestic, will ultimately fail. And it's not going to come under the current system as it's currently configured. You're not going to get that with people like Joe Manchin holding the U.S. Senate hostage. You're not going to get it if the Republicans seize control of the majority again in the Senate with Mitch McConnell. Forget about it. Or as we say in New York, forget about it. Ain't happening. And it's not going to happen under Joe Biden, that's for sure. It's not going to happen under future Republican presidents, unless both the Democrats and Republicans really, number one, make a clean, honest break with neoliberalism, meaning market fundamentalism. And two, if the anti-lobbying laws are strengthened and made much more radical and place much more teeth in there, like, for example, lifetime ban for lobbying by any employees or officials of federal, state, and local governments, military, and intelligence services. And also a complete ban on Americans lobbying on behalf of foreign corporations, foreign governments, and other foreign entities, as well as also moving to a system of clean elections where we would have shorter election times, where we don't have like 2 years and people are running for a year or two for office. No, make it shorter. And also, let's take a look at public funding of elections too as well. So candidates can compete truly on their ideas and how it meshes up with our Constitution, our history, and what works and what doesn't work. So, yeah, I mean, there's more. This is a great quote. And without these much needed efforts to control the proliferation of shell companies in the United States, there is little hope for the broader liberal democratic projects around the world. Because the thing that ties all the modern anti-American, anti-democratic regimes and movements together around the globe isn't some illiterate blinkered ideology like communism or a moral grotesquerie like fascism. It is instead greed, rampaging, unrepentant, unalloyed, embodied by the ruling regimes entrenched in the pursuit of power and an ever-expanding pocketbook. It's a kleptocratic greed we've seen take root in Moscow, with Putin and his cronies clinging to power, posing as Russian nationalists in order to siphon off billions for themselves. It's a kleptocratic greed we've seen spread through Beijing, where the officials and the family members connected to the ruling Chinese Communist Party have transformed themselves into little more than a gluttonous regime dedicated to pillaging the Chinese people and leading to a genocide against minority ethnicities like the Uyghurs along the way. It's a kleptocratic greed we've seen subsume regimes in Caracas, meaning in Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, and Tehran, capital of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Pyongyang, which is, of course, the capital of North Korea. It's a kleptocratic greed we've seen wherever a democracy is tilted into illiberal authoritarianism or where dictatorships already rule. It's a kleptocratic greed unmitigated and unceasing that now presents the greatest threat to the U.S. and its democratic allies. As journalist Oliver Bullock once wrote, kleptocracy is for the 21st century what fascism and communism were for much of the 20th century. And he's right. The only difference, this transnational threat isn't emanating from Moscow or Berlin or Beijing or Rome. It is instead reliant on its sustained by the kleptocratic services of the U.S. provides in droves, which outpace even those provided by the traditional offshore havens of yore. So, and I think that he's largely correct on that issue. However, I would differ with Michel's point on one area, and that is, his name is Casey Michel, and that would be, this is what we see here from this book discussion, American Kleptocracy, is the marriage of where governments, dictatorships in Venezuela, in North Korea, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, China, Putin's Russia, they all are committed to an anti-American ideology. That's where I kind of differ. But what they do is they weaponize greed, and they enjoy the fruits that international trade, shell companies, investing in American hedge funds and whatnot, they enjoy the fruits of their wealth. But they have a mission to bring down and corrupt the United States from within, and also commit aggression and subversion from without as well. And what they do is they look at the pressure points, the weak spots in America's sort of Tea Party, Reagan, Milton Friedman driven economic policies. And they say, okay, greed is their creed. Let's undermine them. We're disciplined enough to protect the interests of our countries and to export our ideology and worldview and knock America off of its pedestal, thereby creating what they would view as a multipolar world, with ultimately Russia and China on the top of the pyramid of global powers. And they're going to use any and all weaknesses in America's liberal capitalist society, government, and economy to eventually overthrow it. And this is where, when we talk about protecting liberal and democratic institutions, I think we have to take a look and really we have to take a serious look and abridge a number of our aspects of our laissez-faire liberal political and economic system, laissez-faire compared to the rest of the developed world. And we have to put limitations, some very severe limitations on political and economic laissez-faire liberalism. That's the only way we're going to deal with this. Because otherwise, you're going to get people like George W. Bush and Phil Gramm and all these globalist, reactionary, anti-American politicians that claim, that wave the American flag, but in reality, they just use it as a cheap punchline in their political advertising and campaigns. These people have to be dislodged from power. They have to be discredited, and it takes a mass-based popular movement of all classes predicated on civic nationalism and populism to ultimately get the job done. So I close this episode of The Populist Patriot, and we'll have a couple of more episodes coming right up.